Hey, hello, how you doing? My name is Tehja, and today is another installment of making the Playboy bunny costume accessories, and today we'll be making the collar for the Playboy bunny suit. So we'll be using the same fabric I use for the cuffs, which is a cotton polyester broadcloth fabric in the classic white. And these are the patterns I'll be using for the collar. It's the same pattern set from Ariah Black, and it's just 2 pieces for the collar, but we'll cut 2 of each piece to have 4 pieces in total. So here I'm just lining up my pattern pieces onto the cotton polyester broadcloth fabric and just cutting them out. Easy peasy, no problem. And make sure you transfer all of your notches from the pattern pieces onto the cut fabric as well. So after we cut out everything, you should again have 4 pieces, 2 for each pattern piece, and with those pairs, out of 1 piece out of the pair, you should fusible interface that piece, 1 piece. So 1 of each of the collar pieces, you should have at least 1 fusible interfaced piece. And I'm using the same fusible interfacing that I use for everything. So I'm just ironing down everything, and this is kind of where I messed up a tiny bit. tiny bit. Oh shit, I'm interfacing the table. So these are the pieces I have. Of course, once I fusible interfaced the pieces I needed, I cut off the excess and made sure that it aligned with the actual shape. So now what we're going to do, we're going to push the smaller bottom collar pieces out the way and work on the bigger top collar pieces. So I'm just going to lay them right sides kissing, and I'm going to sew all around the collar piece except for that, internal or inner curve part. That's where the neck should be. And I'm going to sew at a 1/2 inch. And I forgot to tell y'all, with Ariah Black's patterns, you always have to add seam allowance. So I added a 1/2 inch seam allowance around all of the pattern pieces. So I'm just quickly pinning everything together, and I'll take this to the sewing machine. Okay, so now that's sewn together, I'm quickly going to cut 1/2 of the seam allowance off for the rounded corners, just to make sure that the collar pieces in the corners of the collar pieces are sharper, than if you didn't cut that off. And then I'm going to flip this collar piece inside out and then iron it flat. I'm using clips here to line up the raw edges of this collar piece, just to really make sure that it's just as accurate as possible once I iron it down. And then once I iron it down, I will sew a top stitch along the same edges or the same corners, the same path that we sewed the first time, if that makes any sense. Lord, it's hard to explain, but y'all can see what I'm doing. So I'm just going to top stitch it real quick, pretty much like a 1/16 of an inch away from the edge, all the way around except for the raw edge part. So that's what it looks like once you top stitch it, and it's looking pretty good. It's coming together. I'm just cutting off any excess fabric from flipping the collar inside out. Okay, so now we're taking the bottom collar pieces and we're going to make a collar sandwich. All right, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to place the bottom collar piece and place it on the top collar piece right sides together. So I'm taking the fusible interface piece first and aligning it with the side of the fusible interface part of the top collar, and I'm just going to lay them down right sides together along the raw edges. And you see that the curves don't line up yet, but we'll eventually make them line up as we pin them along, so that the curve, it's supposed to be, the way it's supposed to be, if that makes any sense. So I'm going to do the same thing to the other bottom collar piece. I'm going to put it to the back side of the top collar piece and aligning it right sides together, making sure that all the notches line up appropriately. So then voila, you should have a collar sandwich. So again, making sure all the notches line up, and I'll be pinning the bottom collar pieces to the top collar piece and manipulating the bottom collar pieces so that it rounds and fits the curve of the top collar piece. Okay, so now that everything is pinned together, we need to pin the little like tabs on the side of the collar, if that makes any sense, the little bottom collar tabs, because they are not pinned appropriately and we need to sew along that edge as well. So there should be a notch on that side that I'm touching, but I didn't see it on the pattern, so I didn't transfer it to the fabric. But I'm going to guesstimate that those tabs on the sides of the collar need to be about 1 inch wide because they need to overlap each other or to connect, right? So I'm just going to move that top collar piece over until the tabs of the bottom collar piece are about 1 inch wide. So I'm moving that over to give the little tabs a little bit more space to live and to breathe. And so I'm just going to place a pin there and then fill in the rest of the space of the tab with pins as well. So we'll be sewing all along where all the pins is at, okay? Making sure not to sew the top part of the top collar piece. So I'm going to do the same thing on the other side, and then I'll sew everything together at 1/2 inch. So again, everything is sewn together and it's starting to really shape up. But before we flip the bottom collar inside out, we have to snip the seam allowance of the curved edges about 1/2 of the width. So I'm just going to do that real quick. So again, we have those clean, sharp corners. So now that that's done, we are now going to flip the bottom collar piece inside out completely, just making sure that it is, flipped out entirely with the corners. Make sure there's no extra seam allowance or seams, kind of gathering up. We want it to be as sharp as possible. So now that that's flipped out, we still have some raw edges we have to account for. So what I'm going to do is take those raw edges and fold them inward 1/2 inch, the seam allowance, and I'm going to iron them down on each side of the bottom collar. It's very similar to what we did, I believe, for the cuffs as well. It's the same thing. So that's what I'm doing right now real quick. It's just folding the raw edge in 1/2 inch and using some clips because I will be ironing that down so that it stays in place. You see, I clipped everything. I'm gonna iron that down real quick, and then once it's completely flat, iron, crispy, then I'm going to take those clips off and we'll top stitch the bottom collar all the way around at, 1/16 of an inch. And that will secure those raw edges inside the collar so it won't be seen anymore. And that will be it for the construction of the collar, like the bases of the collar. We just have some little touches here and there, and then we have to add the accoutrements to the collar after that. So as you see here, I'm just pinning everything, right and tight so that I can just sew it really easily. everything is sewed down and it looks like a professional collar. It looks really, really, really good. So now last thing to do is to choose which side you want to be shown as your outside layer. Industry standard is the non-interface side to be shown as the outside layer, but I'm doing the interface side because the cotton broadcloth fabric is a little see-through, and with the interfacing you don't see it as much. So you're going to choose that side and have it face the back of you, and then you're going to fold the top collar down towards you and clip it in place and then iron that down so it takes the official collar shape. So boom, that's what your collar should look like. We just need to add the closure and the bow, and it'll look extra, extra special, extra spicy, and like the traditional, like what 1950s, 60s Playboy collar. So now we're moving on to the bow now that the collar is almost finished. So what I did is that I cut out a 5-inch wide by 9-inch long piece of fabric. That is the same fabric I used for my Playboy bunny suit, and I am going to fold that in half and sew it at 1/4 inch. Then I'm going to flip it inside out just with the safety pin. Y'all see me do this a million different times. All right, and then I'm going to make sure that seam is in the middle of the back of the bow. So now with the back of the bow where the seam is facing us, we're going to fold the bow edges inward towards the middle of the bow, slightly overlapping. And I place a pin there so it's like held there. It doesn't have to be like completely accurate, but accurate enough. Now I'm going to take a needle thread of the matching color and run a basting stitch or a gathering stitch in that middle of the bow. Once the stitches ran through the fabric, I'm going to pull it so it gathers together, and then wrap the thread around the bow so that the center is really tight and is starting to look like a bow. And then I'm just going to secure the thread by running a stitch like in the middle of the bow. It's hard to see because it's all black. And then I'm going to tie a knot. Just make sure that the stitch isn't too wide because you want everything that we've done here so far to be hidden. So I'm going to snip that and then take the other fabric piece, which is a 3 inches long by 1 inch wide, and you're going to fold the long edges of that piece of fabric to the middle so it kind of creates a more slender rectangle. So now what we're going to do is place that part, making sure that the raw edges are facing towards the bow, around the middle of the bow to act as like the little, I don't know, like the centerpiece of the bow. And here I realized that the bow is a little bit, or like the centerpiece of the bow is a little bit too long. So I'm like snipping it because you don't want too much of an overlap of the centerpiece of the bow, because then it'll eventually, that seam for the overlap will eventually be seen. So I'm just adjusting it as best as I can, making sure that it's not too long, and snipping it little by little as I go until you can overlap that centerpiece of the bow in the back of the bow. So all of it is hidden from the front. So once you secure that, you just hand sew it down until it's secure. And I like to hand sew it just between the edges or the ends of the centerpiece of the bow. I don't like to sew it to the actual bow. You can do like one tiny stitch to make sure it stays in place. But I don't like to sew it like straight into the bow because I want to keep the threads hidden as much as possible. Because after you do that, then the bow is pretty much done. You just secure it with a knot and snip off the extra thread, and then it's time to add the bow to the collar part. So I'm taking a white thread and needle, and then I'm going to take the collar, overlap the tabs to see which tab I prefer to be the front tab, and that's where we're going to sew the bow to. So then I'm going to take the bow and align the center of the bow onto the collar where kind of the collar actually starts. And I'm just going to hand sew the bow onto that tab, and secure it as best as possible. And then that's pretty much it, really. But then when I tried on the bow, I realized that I didn't like tried on the collar, I didn't like the placement of it. So then I readjusted it a little bit later, but that's essentially what you can do. So you can either align it that way, or you can try on the collar, place the bow where you want it to be, and then hand stitch it that way. So now what's left is to hand sew the snaps on. So the snap that sticks out will go on the tab that has the bow on it on the back side, and the snap that receives will go on the front of the tab that goes on the back that is overlapped, if that makes any sense. But you just hand sew the snaps on. If you know how to hand sew snaps, then you just go and do that the way you need to do it. I'll also link a video down of where I hand sewed my snaps for my Ariana Grande Sweetener Tour video as well. You get a better look on how to do that as well. But yeah, after you sew on the closure, then that's pretty much it. And then your collar is ready to go. And this is how the collar came out. It looks so good, and it looks so close to the original. Like I'm very proud. Like, I feel very good about it. And yeah, and it's just super easy to make. If you definitely have like some basic sewing skills, like, it's super duper easy to make. So that is it for this video. Next video will be how to make the prize ribbon and the how to attach the bunny tail to the Playboy bunny suit. And that will be it for the installments of how to make the Playboy bunny accessories. So please subscribe and turn on your post notifications so you get notified whenever I do post. And as always, lovelies, please love yourself, and I will see you next video. Mwah!